Couple points of business. Let me see if I can remember. It's one of those days. It gets crazy sometimes. It's about to get crazier. We are being booted out of 153B starting Monday for 2 weeks. From higher ups, they are going to do dean search meetings in this room. And so adapt, improvise, and overcome. So we will move. They normally wouldn't have enough seating for us, but I'd say, look around, everybody. How many people were in this classroom for our exams? A lot more than what's in it right now, right? So after giving it a lot of thought, I was like, we could probably get by with a normal classroom, considering how many students typically come to face-to-face class. And I'm still going to stream it for everybody, but it'll just be a little different. You'll probably forget. I know I will probably forget. So I'll do my best to remind everybody. I'll send emails. I'll post the flyers. So adapt, improvise, overcome. Now your test, guys, the highest grade on the test was 100. And it wasn't me. So I think the more I thought about it, I met with several students in the past couple of days, and I see a common theme. And listen, if this works for you, I'm not saying to rearrange your strategy, but if it's not working for you, we need to try something different. I had a friend of mine in high school, and we were running track. And for the first track meet, coach put him running like a mile. Everybody takes off and they're running their pace. This guy is jogging really, really slow. And we're like, dude, come on, let's go, let's go. He's like, I got it. We get to the final, it's the last lap, fourth lap, the final like 200 meters, and he just starts sprinting in an all-out sprint, going crazy. Everybody's already finished the finish line. Everybody's finished the race. But he takes off like a bat out of Hades, runs the worst time, but he felt exhausted because he jogged 3.5 miles and then sprinted the last part. So in his mind, he gave great effort. But that's not the most optimal way to run a race. And I think you understand my analogy for this, is that if you wait until the end to try to sprint with all this verbiage and all these rights and lefts and illusions, you may feel like you're giving it your all. You may feel like you're exhausted, and you are. But that's not the right way to run a race optimally for the best time, okay? We have to keep pace with the material and not wait until the end to pressure cook it off, okay? I also have, on your Moodle page, I have tons of old lectures. Like you could start kind of looking at stuff into the future if that's what you need. I don't know what you need. I'm not you. I don't know the kind of learner you are. All I can do is offer all these different resources. I also think my students who are helping me do reviews and that kind of stuff, I think that works for some people, and I think it's actually hurting others, because I think the ones that wait till the end, it's getting, oh, well, we're going to do all these reviews and we're going to do all these prep tests, and it almost gives you an extra reason to wait. And I don't think that's working for somebody. So let's try to stay up with the material, and maybe that'll make a difference. Also, drop dates coming up. Don't tempt fate. We're 2 tests in. So if we're seeing a consistent pattern, take that into consideration. Okay. Let's see. Anything else? Anything else I'm forgetting about? All right. Guys, we have to move on. Like we really don't have a lot of time before the end of the semester is going to be here before we know it. Okay. So a quick reminder about our trunk. Our trunk bends, right? Sways in the sagittal. We call that flexion and extension. In the fetal autofetal. In the frontal, we call that left and right lateral bending. And in the transverse, we call that right and left transverse rotation of the trunk. What's cool is that it follows a similar verbiage pattern to the pelvis and transverse plane because it's more pure rotation. So we can follow that same verbiage. The flexion is general. For the pelvis is like a basketball. There's no general motion on the spin in a basketball. It's all pure. That's why for the pelvis, all of the different motions are rotations, okay? Flexion, extension, right lateral, right transverse, left transverse. I talked about several times, we don't use global references, but we can use local references to look at the differentiation between segments. I gave you sternum, I gave you pubis. Stop. Maybe this is not you, you're fine. Maybe in the future, give me a heads up, because that's similar to someone coming in late, even though technically on paper you were here, the interruption just messes with my brain, okay? All good? It's a neat thing. Saying in the future, just give me a heads up when you need feedback. Is that okay? All right, guys, where was I? So what we need to understand is that unlike a building that's going to sway in the wind, our trunk can sway from top to bottom, but it can also sway from bottom to top. Okay, that's the weird thing about human movement that we don't see in, the tree sways from top to bottom, but the tree never sways from roots to top, okay? So that is different for us. So today's lecture is going to emphasize how our trunk and our pelvis can move, not because the hips move it, but because the trunk, literally like palming the basketball from the top. That's the analogy I gave when I said I could spin the basketball from the bottom, like with my hips. I could spin it with my right, spin it with my left, or really spin it with both. Or I could palm the basketball and spin it from on the top. And that's kind of what the pelvis does, okay? Some of the illusions that we're going to see, I have several examples up here, is hip moving, but not being responsible for spinning the pelvis. So in other words, when the hips will move, that is to help with like momentum to rotate your pelvis, or it's to help your functional circle of reach of your knees. So in other words, if I say, bring your knees to your chest, all right? My hips can only bring my knees so far. But if I can flex my trunk, doesn't my knees get close to my chest? So what we're going to see is we're going to notice when our feet are off the ground and our upper extremity is fixed, that a similar thing can happen. Knees to chest. Well, my hips can bring my knees to my chest. But also, bending my trunk can help bring my knees to my chest. So it's not to say that all of this motion was hip. Some of that motion was trunk bend, or we call flexion, right? And where we really see the pelvic girdle rotation is that waterline, the belt line. You see it on the pelvis. If I'm just moving my hips, my waist isn't going to go anywhere. But as soon as I start to do this kind of stuff, pelvic girdle rotation, because the trunk is moving. Okay? So that's going to be the emphasis of today's lecture. And I strongly encourage, I know it's tough, but if you have questions, I know some of you don't mind asking questions, but just feel free to ask questions. And what I might do is do more. I'm always trying new things. I might give you an example and I'll say, think about it, give a minute to think about it. And I may walk around and maybe if you have a question you've been waiting for, but you don't feel like asking it in class, you can ask it to me. Another thing we're limited to is that we only have a 10-minute transition before the next class. So I think sometimes students may want to talk about more stuff. And feel free to come to my office hours if you have some more specific questions. All right, let's have some fun. This is my personal favorite section of class, just because it's unique. It's unique situations. Okay, so let's take a look at a kind of like a side plank. All right. This question, I'm not even going to ask you about pelvic. In fact, on the test, I'm not going to ask you about pelvic rotation. Also, who noticed? Well, I'm not going to ask you about pelvic rotation in this question because there's a lot of translation of up and down as well. Who noticed, whether you did good or bad or in the middle, how many questions on that test came from class or came from my literally the unit materials or so keep in mind, like when we go over these, like these are the ones that I pulled on, okay? So let's just analyze trunk, okay? Let's just analyze trunk. And yeah, feel free to take pictures. That's what it's about. Trunk, so top to bottom, his trunk is starting off, remember, I'm not going to ask you about 1 degree, 2 degrees. So for the most part, his trunk's mostly straight at the top, but now it's not straight at the bottom. And I'm asking you to see, or at least infer with clues, how his trunk would be bent laterally. You see how this would be a lateral thing? It's not a sagittal, it's not a transverse, it's a lateral. Is his right shoulder closer to his right hip, or is his left shoulder closer to his left hip? Right to right or left to left? Right to right. And he started out where it wasn't. So if he went right to right, he had to have right lateral trunk bending. Does that make sense? Okay. So it's just another way of showing you how from here to there, you can also do like from here to there. You see how it's the same thing? Okay. With your cameras, I think another cool technique too is to snap the picture, freeze it, and then rotate it over. And like sometimes I'll do where you can kind of see it as if he was standing, and from here to there would be the same as from there to there. That's a good technique too, I think. Okay. What about his? I think they're. No, we'll ask for another. Good. Oh, what about coming up? Would be the opposite, right? So in other words, don't memorize right to right, left to left, because sometimes we may start closer and then we end in anatomical, and the only way that can happen is if we bend the other way, right? So although it's important to kind of start off with these concepts, don't forget that starting off bent to the right and ending up straight meant that you bent to the left. So when the person comes back up, they would have left lateral trunk bending to anatomical position. Top to bottom, right lateral, arm anatomical. Good? Any questions? All right, let's try another one. Okay, this is a transverse question. This one I feel much more comfortable talking about pelvic girdle rotation and trunk motion because there's much more spin. The other one, it was almost like the pelvis was kind of just dropping straight down and up. There wasn't really a lot of spin. But this one, there's some obvious spin. So 2 questions for this assignment or this kind of practice left. From A to B, how did the pelvis rotate? And how did, or let me ask you this, can you see how that pelvic girdle rotation has nothing to do with the hips? Can we understand that? Like if the lady is here and I said, move your hips, like the pelvis isn't going anywhere until the trunk moves the pelvis because our upper extremity is fixed up here. Does that make sense? So the illusion is you may see legs move, but that didn't make the pelvis fit. Okay? Pelvic girdle rotation from A to B, trunk rotation from A to B. Give it some thought. And as always, talk amongst your friends if you want. Share your answer with your neighbor. If you get the same thing, great. If you get different things, try to figure out why. Why these These motions are important, guys, because eventually when we get to muscles, because muscles influence motion, it's an amplifying error. If I can't get you to see the trunk motion or position, how can we then translate it to specific muscles that are being stretched or specific muscles that are being worked? And if we can't see those things, then you're going to do what most allied health professionals do that don't understand this, then you're just going to default to a term called core. All encompassingly. Working my core, stretching my core. All right? Cores just belong in apples. We need to know specific motions, specific muscles, because one day you're going to be helping specific people with specific needs that may or may not need to innervate or recruit a certain muscle, or it may be contraindicated for certain muscles. So we just can't play a guessing game. We have to know what's going on. Right? Campbell Gates cores. No, I'm just trying to. A to B, left transverse pelvic rotation. We're good. Right transverse trunk rotation. Are we also good? Does anybody see why it's left pelvic, right trunk? Yes, ma'am. I'm so glad the camera's not. No, you're fine. You're fine. I'm just being silly. Left transverse pelvic gird rotation. So the pelvis spun to its left, but the trunk had to spin to its right. Because her sternum, or if you did it, your sternum, would your sternum be looking at your right hip or your left hip in that picture? How the only way that can happen is if your trunk twisted to your right. Cool? So in essence, what happened to the trunk is, and you say, okay, trunk, sternum's like, I'm looking at my right hip. Hey, trunk, I know you didn't move when I got you out of anatomical, but how would you have to move to go back home? And the trunk's like, I'd have to spin to my left to go home. I had to spin to my right when I left. It's the cap in the bottle. It's opening the bottle. You can spin the top part this way or the bottom part that way, and you still get the same relevant motion. It's the board game and the piece. Go forward 8 spaces. I can literally move it forward, or I can move the board back. I still go forward. We're good? It's a great question. And I bet you're going to get it right on the test because yes. Do you like my breakdown? In my day, let's go, handler, go. What about coming back up? Coming back up, and when I say coming back up, like bringing her legs up, bringing her knees up, it would be right transverse pelvic and left transverse trunk. And if she brought the knees over to the other side, it would just be a continuation of right transverse pelvic and left transverse trunk. So how do we differentiate kind of those quadrants? We'd say like left transverse trunk to, left transverse trunk from, right transverse trunk to, right transverse trunk from. Yeah, sternum and hips, great landmarks. Sternum and hips, great landmarks. Look to your right, look to your left. But this is also looking to the right, and this is also looking to the left from the trunk's perspective. All right, having some fun today. All right, here we go. My wife took this picture of me last night. I was able to edit out the background of our kitchen and just, I might have edited a little bit more, but the point is, all right, that ain't true. Okay, let's do trunk. And I think there's enough evidence there to do cervical. Cervical follows the exact same rules as the trunk. The bends are the same, flexion, extension is the same, the twists are the same. Landmarks, nose or chin, doesn't matter unless you're MMA, they're going to be lined up. and your sternum. Okay? In terms of frontal, ears and shoulders. So think about it. We did shoulders, hips. All I'm doing is going another level up and going ears and shoulders. Right ear, right shoulder, left ear, left shoulder. The reason we would typically want to bend as we do things is to keep our eyes level. It's hard to take in data when our eyes are like this. So when we're bending and moving and doing stuff, we try to keep our eyes level as we do it to take in data. Okay? So I think let's just for communication, let's start in the middle and go middle, left, our left, right? I'm not talking about his appendages. I'm not talking about his joints. I'm literally talking middle picture to our left picture. Talk to me about trunk and try to do cervical. And hopefully it would make sense why, as the trunk is doing one thing, the cervical may want to do something else to keep our eyes level. Give that some thought. Motion has zero to do with anything other than motion. So in other words, it doesn't matter that the dumbbell is in his right hand on the picture on the left and the left hand on the picture on the right. And he's using left side trunk muscles here and he's using right side trunk. That's irrelevant. Eventually that's going to be important when we get into muscles influencing motion. But the motion is the motion. Whether it's active, you did it, passive, something else did it, or in this case, resistant. Motion is motion, flexion is flexion, extension is extension. Okay? All right, middle left, right lateral trunk bending. I think that's probably like the 3-foot putt question, right? It looks like it's moving and it is. There's no illusions there. I can see how there might be an illusion at the cervical because as the trunk, his trunk is bending to his right. If his neck didn't bend back, you would be like, oh, this is kind of weird. Bend back to the left, and you kind of stay level. Does that make sense? The illusion is that if I do it at the same time, you may not notice it. If you're looking at the eyes relative to the room, and I've told you several times, don't do that. Don't look at any landmark relative to. You see how his left ear is closer to, like, I won't even say his left shoulder, like his left trap? Because he had to bend back to the left. You see how his right ear is further away from his right trap? Because he had to bend to the left. Cool. All right, if we go middle right, that would be left lateral trunk with a little bit of right lateral cervical. Cool. I also have this law. I mean, it's nothing like Newton. I mean, that dude was amazing. But I have Brian's first law of fitness photographs. It's impossible to look normal during any type of pose fitness. Have you ever noticed that? Like when people are posing for like fitness stuff, like, it's hard to like look normal. That'll be on the test. I'm joking. All right, let's keep going. I like this photo. Because this person can't get his knees up to his chin without pelvic girdle rotation and trunk motion. There's no way. Does that make sense? Like you could be the most flexible person in the world. You may get your knees close to your chest, but you're not getting there unless the trunk does this. See what I'm getting at? So I'm not disrespecting hip motion in this, but the hip motion isn't going to rotate the pelvis. The trunk in this case is going to rotate the pelvis. The hip motion can help generate some momentum that makes it easier for your trunk muscles to influence the pelvic girdle rotation. But until that slinky bends, that trunk isn't going to posteriorly rotate. Does everybody understand why that would be posterior pelvic girdle rotation to get him to that position? Posterior spin. Like if he was going to do like a back roll, wouldn't it be the same kind of spin? And then when he would come down, it would be anterior spin. Posterior spin to get him there, anterior spin to get him down from there. Trunk flexion to get him there, trunk extension to get him out there. Not making sense? Okay. What part of it specifically? Give me another shot at it.
The anterior, posterior.
Awesome, awesome. Awesome, awesome, awesome. Okay, so yoink. I have another theory. There's always a prop to be used. You just got to think about it. Pelvis. Okay. When we did it from the hips, we had anterior spin, posterior spin. No problem. Okay. So for this one, I always wear my jacket. I don't know if I'm the only person. Maybe I'm usually freezing beach balls, like tripping over penguins in the hallway, cold. All right, let's see if I can do this. Here's my pelvis. If you can't see, stand up, please, because I'm kind of running out of space over here. This is the top of my pelvis. Do we see that at least? Okay. Do you remember how in the sit-up, this was anterior because of hip flexion, and this was posterior because of hip extension? Okay. So if I take my feet off the ground, this will be posterior, and this will be anterior. Posterior, anterior. Posterior, anterior. It's also called an inguinal hernia. What I just did. Did that make sense? It's all about the spin. And then in this case, it's what spun it. When my feet are off the ground, I can independently move my hips. It's only until my trunk bends. And that's why like you want to brace, you want to anchor this part, right? You want to fix this. This is feet now. My hands are like my feet. Posterior, anterior. Hey. Tom Holland, your job is safe.
Okay, but when you're laying on the ground, but your feet haven't fully come up yet, your trunk is still anatomically, right? Or is that hard to say?
Well, it's not hard to say. It's just definitely not something. Well,
Or to see?
Well, there's some clues in the clothing. So in athletic training, when I was practicing, we would do these tilts. All this is this done on the ground. That's all it is. So in this regard, we would look for the low back. We would look for just how, like you have a natural kind of bend or arc in your low back. If I wanted to make my low back flat, I would want to posteriorly pelvic girdle rotate because of trunk flexion, right? And hip extension. Anterior pelvic girdle rotation because of trunk extension. And you see there's more space back here because my trunk's extending, and hip flexion. So there is this combo that you can do where this is on the ground and this is on the ground. And you can do posterior, anterior, flexion, extension. Did that kind of get to your question? If I were to ask that kind of question, probably the person wouldn't have clothing on so that you could see the arc in the back. And it would be super obvious. Like the cat-cow question that I gave last week was super obvious, right? That's similar to a cat-cow, just in a different position. Good question. Okay. Let's see. And think about it, guys. Wouldn't this exercise be working the C word? The one that I don't want to say. At the core, your trunk muscles. Wouldn't that be working your abs? Because you're moving your trunk. It should kind of make sense. Cool? All right. This machine is in the weight room, and that's actually why I'm asking it. One, it's a more difficult movement to see, but it's one that as long as you have your ID, which you in bourgeois, so you should, you could go do it, practice it, feel it. Talk to me about pelvic girdle and trunk. And sorry, I gotta catch my breath. Sometimes thoughts collide. Last semester, it took me, and that's okay, but it took me a long time to explain to a student that that's not hips. Like the hips are going along for the ride. Right? Like the hips are just like they're just going along for the ride. It's pelvis and trunk, and it should make sense because you get in there and you're fixing your upper extremity, like you're anchoring this part. Okay. All right, give it some thought. Yes, ma'am.
Just to clarify, both these move, these legs.
Yes, but just make sure we're understanding that it's not because he moved his legs. Yeah. So let's look for clues in the clothing. On the picture on the left, key landmarks that I gave you, nose or chin, doesn't matter to me. I just think chin to chest sounds fluid, right? Chin, sternum, pubis, all facing forward. Cool? But in the picture on the right, his sternum is still relatively facing forward, but how's his pubis facing? Do you see that? You see it? Yeah. Wouldn't his pubis, the front of his pelvis, be like facing the waist sack? That's not normal. So in other words, something had to move to get the front of his pelvis to be looking that way. So you see how there's clues there? Okay, here's a thought. Yeah. Yeah, you just have to remind. But you know where all this, even, I mean, I'll do my best. I just have so many requests. I just Googled trunk machine exercises. That's where I got it. Good old Google. From left to right, right transverse pelvic girdle rotation. Guys, if his trunk spun to the right, he would have to have broken the machine, and he would be looking at us. Like if his pelvis and trunk both spun to the right, he would be looking at us. So if his pelvis spun to the right, does it make sense that his sternum is now looking more at his left hip? True? How does your sternum look towards your left hip? You have to spin to the left. The trunk has to spin to the left. Left transverse trunk. Right transverse pelvic, left transverse trunk. Cool? Yes, ma'am.
Okay, so how do you can you just repeat how you distinguish trunk motion and pelvic motion?
Sure. The pelvis, this goes back to our Unit 2 lecture, but the pelvis is like a basketball spinning. The joints, trunk, hips, are what spun it. So if I say, is the basketball spinning? You would say, yes. How? Right transverse, left transverse, right lateral, left lateral. And then the follow-up question would be, that's cool. What spun it? So in this case, the pelvis spun to the right transversely. What spun it was the trunk spinning left transversely.
And you can use the sternum to determine where the trunk.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah. Because when we rotated the pelvis because of just hips, my sternum and my pelvis stayed lined up. That is the absolute best part of my job. What just happened? When that light bulb goes off, that's what I wake up at 3:30 in the morning for. I'm weird. All right, let's do a quick, what's cool about your seats is that they swivel. So even though we're not on our knees like in this exercise, as long as we can take our feet off the ground, in fact, we kind of did this a little bit in the last test, right? Or I think one day we kind of did this last. So just know everybody's going to have to spin, not everybody, but half of you probably going to have to spin one way, the other half are going to spin the other because of these beams. So if the beam is on your left, I want you to try to keep your sternum lined up straight with the table and rotate your pelvis to the right. If the beam is on your right side, keep your sternum lined up and spin your pelvis to the left. And hopefully you can kind of see how, and to me, this is a great way to really see the trunk motion, guys. Watch me. Watch old Kim. I did right transverse pelvic. Now I'm going to put my feet on the ground and say, okay, trunk, I knew you were an anatomical, now you're not. How would you have to rotate that like I'm more comfortable with to go back home? And my trunk's like, I have to spin to my right to go back home. And that tells me, it proves to me that my trunk has a spin to the left when I left. Is that cool? It's the same motions. All right, this is more like me taking a picture. How about this kind of question? From here, from this starting position, you observe right lateral pelvic girdle rotation. So in these scenarios, I'm not showing you what happened. I'm giving you a start position, and then I'm telling you to observe a specific pelvic girdle rotation. From here, he does right lateral pelvic girdle rotation. What must his trunk do? There's no exceptions. If the pelvis spins to the right lateral, his trunk has to bend to the left. Does that make sense? So in this case, it's not my left shoulder going to my left hip, it's my left hip coming up to my left shoulder. It's the same bend. It's the exact same bend. And I will show you if I can find my slinky. All right, guys, who's got my slinky? Knowing me, I'll probably put it in my pocket or something. Ta-da! Okay. Left lateral. Left lateral. Same bend. You see how the pelvis would go right lateral, pour water out the right side. The left side of the trunk would bend to the left. Okay. All right, from this position, you see right transverse pelvic girdle rotation. It's literally a different way of doing the same thing we did on our chairs. It's just in a different start position. It's the same concepts as when we just did the chair. It just might look different because the dude's hanging from our own chair. Right? But it's the same thing. From here, left transverse pelvic. Trunk has to do what? Absolutely, has to. He's up here, and the pelvis spins to the left. my trunk has to spin to the right. And the reason is because this stuff is fixed. It's not gonna bust through break through the bone Roman chair. So when your upper extremity is fixed, it's almost kind of, I know I don't like to make rules, but when your upper extremity is fixed, it's like you're gonna always kind of have this opposition because the trunk isn't free to move. Your trunk isn't free to summate. Your trunk can only cancel. Right lateral pelvic, left lateral trunk. Left lateral pelvic, right lateral trunk. Right transverse pelvic, left transverse trunk. Left transverse pelvic, right transverse trunk. Does that make sense? I've never done this before. God, this is gonna seem so weird. Landmark for the sternum, landmark for the pelvis. Right transverse pelvic, left transverse trunk. You see that? Sternum pubis. Let me put my fingers out because this is getting weird. Sternum pubis, true. Right transverse pelvic, because of left transverse trunk. Left transverse pelvic, because of right transverse trunk. You see that? Let's try the frontal like this. Sternum, right side, left side, right side, left side. Right lateral trunk, right lateral trunk. So left lateral pelvic, because of right lateral trunk. See that? Let's say he comes down. Let me try to make this bigger. Sorry, guys. Is that better? Okay, so he comes down. What would be the pelvic girdle rotation and what would be the trunk motion? Guys, the legs are going to distract you. Don't care about the legs. Because from there, he could flutter kick the hips. It doesn't matter. The hips can help his momentum and the hips could be a rigid link. But that's about pelvic and trunk. It's about your ab muscles making you do these things, okay? So if he lowers his body down to lay back flat on that incline, it's going to be because of anterior pelvic girdle rotation and trunk extension. Him coming up would be posterior pelvic girdle rotation because of trunk flexion. Cool? All right, let me end on a couple cervical. Okay, same rules, but instead of going here to here, we're just leveling up and going here to here. Okay, I start. And I do, you see this. Did the cervical vertebra rotate? Okay, great. How did it rotate? Right transverse, outstanding. A to B is the same as A to B. Landmarks, it's the same as this. Looking at my right shoulder. Looking at my right shoulder, okay? This one should be easy because it was on our first test, but if I did something like this, you should be able to tell me that that was extension. And this would be flexion. Cool. If I did something like this, you should be able to tell me that that's right lateral, right ear close to the right shoulder. And this would be left lateral. It's very hard for us to move our whole head to the side and collect data. So we need ways to kind of keep our eyes as level as possible. That's how we do it. Okay. I think one of the hardest combinational questions would be something where like pubis, make sure the pubis sternum, nose or chin, and if I rotate, so I start off being, I don't have to start, I'll start off in any time. I start here and I do this. For this one, I didn't have pelvic rotation. My pubis didn't spin anywhere. So all I had was left transverse trunk and right transverse cervical. Does that make sense? If my cervical vertebra didn't move, this is what you would have seen. That makes sense? But because I stayed looking, my cervical vertebra spun to the right so that I could stay looking forward. Make sense? I want to keep my eyes on something and I may need to reposition my hands to do something else. I need a mechanism so that as my body is trying to make me look to the left, I have something that can happen at the same time to make sure I keep looking forward. So I'm going to twist my cervical to the right. Okay? I could have right transverse and not move my trunk. So in this case, it would be left transverse pelvic because of hip motion. My trunk didn't go anywhere, but my cervical twisted to the right. Lined up, so I know there was no trunk. Not lined up, so I know that there was cervical. You see those? I'm okay with landmarks as long as they're within the body and they're not in the room. We don't want to say pubis and floor. We don't want to say nose to ceiling. We don't want to do that. That's what's going to get us into trouble. We can't say ears and shoulders or nose and sternum. We can use landmarks relative inside the body to help differentiate these things. But we definitely don't want to use global in the room landmarks. Notice this pattern? It'll get you in trouble. All right, you guys, you've been a great audience. Have a good weekend.